The Sunday sun slipped through the thin curtains of the modest Brooklyn apartment, casting lazy stripes of light on the worn wood floor where Laura sat with her laptop open. She shifted in her seat, rubbing a hand across her forehead. There was a heaviness in her face that had grown over the last 2 years, the kind that comes from waiting and wondering for far too long. Each day in New York felt strange, so different from the small Indiana town where her entire world had flipped upside down. Even the simple things, the way people hurried down the street, the constant sirens outside, the distant hum of the subway, seemed to underline just how far she was from what was once familiar. Laura listened to Mark pacing behind her, his sneakers quietly brushing the old wooden boards. He was on the phone with a detective from the local NYPD precinct, voice hushed but urgent. She caught snatches of his conversation, the way he tried to sound calm while really every word was tight with nerves. It was always like this now. Hope and fear bundled together so tightly that she barely knew the difference. They had been led down dead ends before, but this anonymous tip couldn't be ignored. Even the smallest chance was too important to dismiss. As Mark wrapped up the call, Laura kept her eyes on the digital map pulled up on her screen. Her fingers moved the mouse slowly, zooming in and out, studying every street north and south of the tiny Harlem cafe, where the tip suggested they might find some clue. The address felt like a fragile line thrown across a stormy sea, something to cling to even if she knew it might not hold. Still, her instinct pushed her to scan street after street, pausing over faded shop fronts and narrow alleyways, as if some hidden sign would jump out and guide her to Emily. Sometimes she imagined seeing her daughter's face in the blurry images captured by the street view, a quiet hope rising every time she turned a virtual corner. The image of Emily walking out of Sunday school at St. Luke's Church 2 years earlier haunted her. One moment, everything was ordinary, crowded sidewalks, children chattering as they left the old brick chapel. And the next, Emily was simply gone. The empty space she left behind got bigger with each day, each unanswered question. In all this time, searching had become Laura and Mark's new normal, their jobs and old friends fading to the background. Every morning, their first thought was, maybe today. The lead they got last week had pointed them towards Central Park, where someone at a local street fair had mentioned seeing a girl who matched Emily's description. It was the first real tip they had gotten in nearly 6 months, and even though it felt like a long shot, it was enough. Laura and Mark had packed up their bags, left behind the comfort of familiar faces in Indiana, and caught the first non-stop flight into JFK, telling themselves this journey was worth whatever it might cost, emotionally or otherwise. Laura kept replaying the witness's words in her mind, that careful uncertainty. She looked just like her, maybe a little older, maybe a little taller, echoing every time Laura blinked. Sitting at the window now, maps spread out on the coffee table, Laura plotted out every location that made sense. A few churches, open playgrounds, the nearest library, a soup kitchen. She wanted their plan to be solid, to make the most of what little they had. But it was tough to keep her head clear. Anytime she tried to stay logical, her heart would lurch, tugging her toward random corners, making her wonder if a mother's instinct really could find a lost child just by feeling. She could not let doubt win. When Laura and Mark switched to Street View and started clicking through the images around the farmer's market by Columbus Avenue, both of them felt a sudden jolt. In one blurred picture, a girl in a pink hoodie was walking just ahead of a man, both facing away from the camera. Laura almost dropped her coffee. Her whole body tensed up as she leaned in, staring at the scene in a way that made Mark stop breathing for a moment too. The details were unmistakable, right down to the bold stripes on the back of the hoodie. It was the same sweatshirt Emily had been wearing that terrible day. A thick wave of emotion crashed over them. Laura's heart pounded so loudly she could barely think straight. "We have to try to see her face," she whispered, nudging the mouse to spin the view, hoping for another angle or a clearer shot. But each click brought only more blurry figures and backgrounds. The camera just would not cooperate, and the girl's face stayed hidden. Still, the not knowing gnawed at Laura, hope and dread twisting together inside her chest. It was impossible to turn away now. She felt the familiar ache, the desperate need to be sure. the fear that this picture was all they would ever get. Mark, who had grown more skeptical after so many dead ends, tried to keep Laura grounded. He gently reminded her of all the times they had followed tips that ended with them sitting in a coffee shop, tired and disappointed, staring at each other across cold cups. "I know you want this to be something, Laura," he said softly, putting his hand on her shoulder, "but you see how blurry it is. We have been down this road before." Laura listened, or at least she tried to, but deep down she was done letting logic take the lead. A mother's certainty is something no one else can really challenge. The little details, the color of the pants, the way the girl's head tilted, simply felt too right for her to just dismiss. With her pulse racing and hands shaking a bit, Laura stood up, determination clear on her face. "We have to go check," she insisted. There was only one way to know for sure, and letting another possible clue slip by might haunt her forever. They gathered missing person flyers, the stack growing thinner each month, but never leaving Laura's bag. Mark grabbed the car keys, and together they headed out, anxious but unwilling to let hope die quite yet. As they drove through the city, Laura took a sudden right turn without warning, her eyes fixed ahead. Mark let out a sigh, glancing at the dashboard clock. "Laura, we really cannot afford to miss the meeting with Detective Harris," he said, trying to sound calm, but failing. She barely heard him, her whole body locked in on the urge to drive down the exact block where that Street View picture had grabbed her attention. She slowed as they rolled past bakeries and small shops, checking every sidewalk for a flash of pink or any sign that Emily had been there. Mark's grip on the passenger door had grown tighter with each block. He understood why she was doing this, but they had already lost count of all the places that felt like they might hold answers but turned out empty. Years of searching had taken their toll. Sometimes it felt as if they were not just searching for Emily, but also for the parts of themselves that had faded since the day she disappeared. The car grew quiet except for the city noise outside. Honking, scraps of someone's music rising from an upstairs window. In that silence, Mark's rational side and Laura's stubborn faith just clashed, hanging in the air between them and making the little car feel much smaller. When Laura finally pulled up outside the small church on the corner, her hands were trembling just a little. This place brought back old memories, potlucks in the basement, Emily's laughter echoing off stained glass, the quiet warmth she used to feel sitting beside her daughter each Sunday. The church stood quiet now, only a faint hum of life drifting out through the double doors. Laura took a deep breath, letting Mark know she wanted to go in alone this time. She grabbed her worn Bible, the one with Emily's name written carefully inside the front cover, and slipped out of the car. The quiet inside hit Laura immediately, wrapping around her like a blanket. For the first time all day, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen just a little. She found herself walking slowly to a pew near the back, setting the Bible on her lap, and listening to the gentle scrape of a broom against the floor. The woman who was cleaning glanced up, giving Laura a tired but kind smile. Laura pulled out her phone, opening the blurry screenshot from Google Maps, and showed it to her quietly. The cleaner squinted, tilting her head. "I see a lot of folks come through here," she replied. "Maybe I've seen them, it's hard to say." That lingering uncertainty pressed in again, heavier than ever. As Laura waited for any further hints from the cleaner, she heard voices coming from a hallway near the altar. Two men in dress shirts and collar tabs stepped out, still deep in quiet discussion. Laura recognized one as the senior pastor she'd met on earlier trips, but the other, taller man looked oddly familiar. When he caught Laura's eye, he did a double take, and something in the set of his jaw told her he too was sorting through memories. Suddenly, it hit her. This was Reverend Thomas, a visiting pastor who had held a big revival weekend in Bloomington only a week before Emily vanished. Laura found herself stepping forward, introducing herself and mentioning her hometown. She watched as realization dawned on Reverend Thomas's face. After a pause, he remembered her, even recalling the big picnic that had brought together so many families. They exchanged a few polite words about the memories from that time, but Laura felt an odd energy between them, a kind of underlying discomfort neither could quite name. Maybe it was the burden of that summer, everything that had been lost and left unresolved. Maybe it was the simple awkwardness of bumping into someone who was connected, however distantly, to the worst weeks of her life. Laura took a deep breath and reached into her purse, pulling out the worn photo of Emily in her soccer uniform, a huge, hopeful smile on her face. She handed it to both pastors, explaining quietly but with determination that this was her daughter and the reason she had come to the church today. The senior pastor gave her a sympathetic look and began to offer words of comfort, his hand settling gently on her shoulder as he promised to pray for Emily's safe return. Reverend Thomas's reaction was less expected. As soon as his eyes found the photo, his whole body seemed to stiffen just for a second. Laura noticed it, even if no one else seemed to. He quickly tried to compose himself, but she was already watching closely. After a moment, he stepped forward and hugged her. The embrace lingered just a little too long, and Laura noticed a faint but recognizable scent of vanilla clinging to his clothes, exactly like the candles Emily had always loved at home. As he pulled away, a corner of something slipped out of his jacket pocket. It looked like an old photograph. Everything about the moment unsettled Laura deeply. She could not put her finger on why, but something here felt wrong, and the uneasy feeling refused to let go. Once Laura stepped out into the sunshine, still clutching her purse, she hurried over to Mark, who had been waiting by the car and nervously scrolling through his phone. She told him everything, how awkward Reverend Thomas had acted, the photo almost falling out of his pocket, that too familiar scent of vanilla. Mark frowned, shaking his head. He was wary of launching any new accusation, especially against someone with such a respected reputation in the community. Laura, I know you're stressed, but we cannot just point fingers without real proof. Vanilla candles are everywhere. You know that, he said, trying to talk her down. The discussion grew tense, neither willing to bend. Mark insisted they were running out of time and did not want to be late meeting with Detective Harris. Laura, meanwhile, felt the urge to do something, certain she was onto something bigger than just a strange feeling. Their voices grew louder, frustration spilling over, the weight of years searching and never truly agreeing on when to stay patient or when to act. As the minutes passed, Reverend Thomas walked out, coat in hand. He made his way to a dusty silver sedan parked under a big oak tree. The moment he opened the car door, that same sweet vanilla scent drifted on the breeze. For Laura, it was impossible to doubt any longer. Everything in her gut told her this was a sign she could no longer ignore. Laura's mind raced as Reverend Thomas pulled away in his car, the vanilla scent still hanging in the air. Almost without thinking, she begged Mark to follow him, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with urgency. Mark groaned, hesitating for a moment, but the look in Laura's eyes was all it took. Resigned, he started the car and pulled into traffic, keeping a careful distance behind the pastor's silver sedan. The inside of their old SUV felt thick with tension, Mark gripping the steering wheel and muttering now and then about how the whole thing felt reckless. Laura barely heard him. Her focus stayed locked on the license plate in front of them. They wound through Chicago, traffic growing lighter as they left downtown, and drifted into a quiet residential neighborhood lined with maples and tidy lawns. Reverend Thomas's car slowed and turned, finally coming to a stop in front of a white brick house with faded shutters. Laura told Mark to stay put as they parked across the street, low in their seats, watching. Minutes stretched, the silence between them broken only by Laura's nervous tapping on the glove compartment and Mark quietly checking his watch for the 10th time. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt heavy, every second amplifying their anxiety and hope. They did not have to wait long before the front door swung open. A woman stepped outside, her arms full of suitcases, and behind her came a young girl with pale blonde hair and freckles. Laura's heart gave a hopeful leap at first, but as the girl turned her face to the sunlight, it became clear she was not Emily. This girl was younger, maybe 10 or 11, and her features were completely different. Laura realized with dull clarity that Reverend Thomas's story about having a daughter visiting must have been true all along. Seeing the family loading their car with the suitcases, chatting and laughing in that regular way, something inside Laura crumbled. She felt foolish for ever letting her hopes swell again, and guilt crept in for dragging Mark along on this chase. She dropped her gaze and couldn't stop the tears from burning behind her eyes. Sensing her despair, Mark gently suggested they switch seats so he could drive to the police station. Laura agreed, barely able to look at him. The drive was quiet and heavy, the engine's steady hum the only sound between them. Laura stared out the window, wrestling with disappointment, trying to gather the strength to move forward after one more letdown. As they drove through the city, Laura sat quietly, her face pressed against the passenger window, watching the world move past in a blur. She tried to convince herself it was over, but her eyes kept drifting to Reverend Thomas's silver sedan up ahead. Even after seeing the other girl, something inside her refused to let go of the chase. She clung to the uneasy feeling that she was missing something, some detail just out of reach. Maybe that was just what years of searching did to a person. You learn not to trust even your own relief. Suddenly, without warning, Reverend Thomas pulled over beside an old city park with swings and faded red slides. Laura sat up straight. "Mark, slow down, please. Just for a second. Let's see what he's doing," she pleaded, hope flickering back to life for the briefest moment. But Mark shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Laura, we have to stop this. We need to get to the station," he said, voice tight with worry and exhaustion. The distance between what Laura felt and what Mark believed seemed wider than ever, and she wrestled with guilt for not letting this go and persistence that kept flaring up again and again, no matter how often hope let her down. By the time they finally pulled up outside the Chicago Police Department, Mark's frustration was clear. They had missed their appointment with Detective Harris, and the empty waiting area was just another reminder of time slipping through their fingers. Mark let out a sigh and shot Laura a pointed look that said all. If only they had not wasted precious minutes chasing Reverend Thomas, maybe things would have gone differently. Laura could not bring herself to argue. Shame weighed heavy in her chest, and she just nodded, barely able to meet his eyes. There was nothing to do except wait for several hours until the detective could see them again. Mark decided to stay inside with his coffee and phone, scrolling through news and trying to distract himself. Laura, on the other hand, needed air. She slipped out onto the sidewalk, breathing in the early afternoon breeze and hoping the movement would settle her restless thoughts. Even now, the knot in her stomach would not loosen. Unable to let it go, Laura pulled up Google Maps on her phone and zoomed in on the neighborhoods they had just driven through. She stared at the screen, searching street corners and rooftops for any small sign she might have missed, clinging stubbornly to the hope that there was still something left to find. As Laura paced outside the police station, she dialed up Rachel, a co-worker from the nonprofit where she volunteered. Laura explained everything. How she and Mark had followed Reverend Thomas, how they had seen the woman and the blonde girl, and the strange feeling she just could not shake. "Rachel, can you do some digging for me?" Laura asked quietly, feeling a fresh wave of hope rise up. "Check out Reverend Thomas and that woman he said was healed at his church. Anything you find, even the smallest detail, might help." Rachel promised to pull whatever records she could and told Laura she would call back as soon as she had something. The call ended, but for the first time all day, Laura felt that maybe she was not just spinning her wheels. There still could be something beneath the surface, waiting to be found. Still restless and needing a distraction, Laura walked further down the street. Soon, she came across a tall, old brick building with a sign that read Lutheran Student Residence. It stood out among the cafes and corner stores, almost out of place. Driven by curiosity more than anything, Laura snapped a few photos and lingered out front, wondering if maybe someone inside might remember seeing either Reverend Thomas or the mysterious woman from earlier. She considered going in, just to ask around, hoping it might give her mind a little peace while she waited for Rachel's call. Laura hung back near a row of hedges as she scanned the parking lot behind the Lutheran dorm. Her heart skipped when she saw the familiar car, a compact gray sedan that matched the one the woman from earlier had driven. Instinct kicked in, and Laura ducked out of sight, careful not to be noticed. Just then, she spotted the woman walking toward the car with a nun at her side. The two women were guiding a small group of children, each with a little suitcase rolling behind them. It looked almost like the kids were heading out for a field trip or maybe going home for the weekend. As Laura counted the children, something made her pulse jump. She looked again, closer this time. There, a glimpse of brown curls and the determined way the girl walked, just like she remembered. Laura's breath caught. Tears pricked at her eyes. That was Emily. There was no mistaking her. Her daughter was there, suddenly so close after 2 long, aching years of wondering and hoping. For a second, it felt as if time froze around her. Everything Laura had feared and wished for came crash. ING together, shock, joy, and disbelief tangled up inside her. Her legs trembled, but her purpose was clear as never before. Laura's hands shook so badly that she almost dropped her phone as she dialed Mark, her voice breaking with urgency. "Mark, you have to come. I'm at the Lutheran residence. Emily is here. Call the police right now." Not waiting for an answer, Laura tucked the phone back in her pocket and sprinted across the lot, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear herself think. She yelled Emily's name, her words thick with emotion. The woman from earlier stepped forward, trying to block her way with arms outstretched. But Laura did not slow down. She dodged past, barely aware of anything except the sight of her daughter only a few feet away. The car door was unlocked, and Laura reached for it, flinging it open. Emily turned, her eyes wide with shock and then quick recognition. All at once, Emily rushed into Laura's arms, clinging tightly as tears rolled down both their cheeks. They held each other like they might never let go. The noises of the parking lot, the shouts from onlookers, and the protests from the woman all faded. For that moment, it was just the two of them, finding each other again after 2 long, terrible years apart. Mark arrived within minutes, breathless and wide-eyed, and darted across the parking lot as soon as he spotted Laura and Emily. Without thinking, he pulled them both into his arms, barely able to speak as relief washed over his face. The 3 of them held each other tightly, not caring who watched or what anyone thought. But the moment was short-lived. The woman tried to hustle the other children back into the car, her mask of calm now replaced with panic. Mark rushed over and stood in front of the car door, blocking her path and glancing quickly at Laura for reassurance. In the distance, police sirens grew louder, echoing against the brick buildings. Squad cars pulled up, and several officers jumped out, quickly taking control before anyone could slip away. They spoke to the children gently, coaxing them from the car and making sure everyone was safe. The nun stepped forward, her hands raised, and explained in a shaky voice that all the kids were under the care of Reverend Thomas's ministry. She insisted they were only being given shelter and care. But as soon as the officers realized that Emily had been missing for 2 years and was the subject of a nationwide search, the tone shifted. Questions about the other children and where they had come from hung heavily in the air, and the officers hustled everyone back toward the station, eager to find out the truth behind the stories. At the police station, Emily was taken into a quiet room where a kind, soft-spoken detective sat down with her. The woman spoke gently, making sure Emily felt safe as she asked questions, hoping to understand everything that had happened while she was away. Meanwhile, Laura waited in the hallway, nerves buzzing. Her phone rang, and seeing Rachel's name pop up, she answered right away. Rachel did not waste any time. She told Laura that Reverend Thomas was living under a fake name and had a long record of fraud in several other states. Even worse, that woman who was supposedly healed at the church had not been seen since that big event. Everything Laura had feared was true, maybe even worse than she thought. Minutes later, officers informed her that Reverend Thomas and his assistant were both being held in custody. They explained that a wider investigation was underway to figure out if more children or families had been hurt. The relief Laura felt for finally hugging her daughter again was real, but it could not wash away the anger inside her. It was hard to understand how someone could twist faith into a cover for such painful crimes. All she could do now was trust that the truth would finally come out for every family involved. After everyone finished giving their statements at the police station, the officer who was helping them let Laura, Mark, and Emily know that Pastor James, the local minister, wanted to invite them to a special service in their honor. It was going to be a way for the community to come together and celebrate Emily's return, a moment of thanks after so much fear and waiting. Laura hesitated at first, but as Mark squeezed her hand, she knew how much their faith had meant through these dark years. With all they had been through, saying yes felt right. It was their way of closing the door on those years of searching and letting hope take over. That night, back at their small house in the Chicago suburbs, Laura stood in the doorway of Emily's room. She watched her daughter finally sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and calm, and a wave of relief washed over her again. For the first time in years, Laura felt the weight in her chest lift. She joined Mark in the hallway, and together they sat quietly, grateful for this simple, ordinary night. Laura realized just how important her instinct, faith, and stubborn hope had been. Even when everything seemed impossible, the love holding their family together had proven to be stronger than anything they had faced.